Hello, Assalamu alaikum viewers. Basically, the students of honors fourth year. Today, I am going to cover a lesson on literary criticism, and the specific topic name is the study of poetry. And this is a piece of literary criticism by Matthew Arnold. And we know Matthew Arnold is a Victorian poet as well as a critic, and he is also called the first modern critic. And in the study of poetry, Matthew Arnold, in fact, has highlighted actually how poetry should be, and this description is basically has been focused from the perspective of the contemporary background, because we know Victorian period was a period of problems because there was conflict, and the conflict arose because of the conflict from science and religions. We know Victorian period is a period of scientific and industrial revolution, and when science got flourished, then some religious beliefs got encountered with scientific evidences. As we know, science gives evidence. On the other hand, religion is a matter of belief. So here, people of the Victorian period, they fell in confusion actually what thing they would accept. Would they accept science or religion? So to demolish this confusion, Arnold has focused on actually poetry. According to him, only poetry can solve all these severe problems from Victorian period. So for that reason, he has observed the contemporary poet and the poet of the other ages, and he tried to find out actually the high ideals of poetry. And according to Matthew Arnold, that poetry, one of the basic component part would be that poetry would be the criticism of life. And my today's topic is actually poetry is the criticism of life. Now I would be explaining actually what Arnold means by criticism of life. So let's see. So first, Arnold gives his concept of poetry. According to Matthew Arnold, poetry is a very delightful things to tease and motivate, as to entertain people. So according to Matthew Arnold, poetry is a means of teasing, delighting, and motivating people. And actually, in fact, the readers. This is Arnold's concept, and from that background, we get actually what is criticism of life. Arnold here explained. So, what is criticism of life? According to Arnold, poetry is the criticism of life, and by criticism of life, Arnold means that poetry would be the explanation of life, because here life would be explained or interpreted completely. As we know that literature is the reflection of life, in fact poetry is the reflection of life. So here, according to Arnold, so the life would be totally reflective in poetry. Then Arnold says that poetry must have integrity between, actually there must have integrity between poetry and human life. As we know that poetry is the criticism of life, so there would be integration, actually the unity between human life and poetry. Actually in poetry, the poets would focus on the lives around them. Actually through reading a poem or poetry, a reader can see actually what is happening around him. Actually a poet would not highlight any strengthening or anything beyond the world or beyond his surrounding. So poetry would focus on the events or incidents that are actually occurring around him. Then so here there should be, and in this way a poetry would have integrity between human life and itself. Then Arnold says that poetry would be the source of elements of human life. Actually here, through reading a poetry, a reader can rectify his or her faults. Actually, we, the readers, read poetry because of rectification, because from poetry we can see life actually how it is, and by reading a poem we can also, as it is the reflection of total life, we can judge which thing we should do and which thing we should not. So yes, in poetry there would have the ingredients of life. And next, Matthew Arnold says in poetry there would have some teaching that would help us to lead our life very easily on the earth. So here in this regard, Arnold focused on moral values of poetry, but not necessarily Arnold says to write poetry on morality, but he focused on writing poetry actually with all the challenges around him. Actually, a man have to survive accepting all the challenges in front of him, and poetry should focus these ideals of life according to Matthew Arnold. Then Arnold says about about the future of poetry, according to him, that poetry would be the shelter and consolation in crisis. And as we know, in the contemporary world, Arnold and his contemporary people face a lot of problems, and according to Arnold, and at that time we know that Victorian people were rescued by poetry, and to Arnold, not only for a very specific period, but for the other periods, human life would be rescued. Whenever it is in trouble, it would be rescued by poetry. So it has a very high value, high actually prospect in future, because in future actually when science, religion and philosophy would fail to console, to motivate, to inspire people, then poetry would take the place of these three things. Actually, poetry would take the place of science, religion and philosophy. He has also given some arguments in favor of his statement, because we know philosophy is only depend on reason, which is quite useless and difficult to understand. On the other hand, science is soulless. Actually, it is just abstract, and religion only gives actually depends on faith and as well as truth, and so which is according to Matthew Arnold indescribable. On the other hand, poetry can actually creates its world according to its own, and here Matthew Arnold says about the poetic truth and poetic beauty. Actually, what is poetic truth and poetic beauty? Poetic truth means that a poet can create his world according to his own. As for example, in regard of religion or history, a historian or a religious person cannot divert from what has happened in the past, but a poet can be diverted from the actual fact, and he can create his own, and thus he can focus on morality. As for example, in the history we can see honest and industrious man had found his doom, but on the other hand, and corrupt or culprit had achieved his goal. But in poetry, a poet can show that the culprit man has got his doom, and an honest man really conquered. So here lies the greatness of poetry, and this is called poetic truth, and it is as well as poetic beauty, because here the poet can use different literary devices, actually diction, rhyme, meter, which inspire a man to read poetry and derive motivation out of poetry. So thus Arnold has explained the criticism that poetry is the criticism of life. So thank you, learners.